Thank you, everyone, for making it today. It is a big ask, I know, but I think you'll find it worthwhile for our program, Trauma at the Border. My name is Francis Shen. I am the executive director of the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, and I want to note to you both of the center's co-founders and co-directors, Dr. Bruce Price, world-leading neurologist, and Dr. Judith Edersheim, world-leading forensic psychiatrist and attorney, are both here with us. I'll say more about the center in just a moment, but I just want to dive into the topic and let you know that this is really a panel of first in two ways. It is one of the first, not the only, but in fact we've done some previous programs, but one of the first events here at Harvard to really put the neuroscience of trauma and the applied clinical practice so closely in dialogue. And I think what you'll begin to see as the panel and the conversation unfolds is that there are a lot of crosstalk possibilities, and what you should know is that this is part of a larger unfolding, I really think, revolution in which law is recognizing that the biosciences and really neuroscience are driving a lot of re-examination of doctrine and practice. So welcome to be a part of that. This is also a first in a more concrete sense, in that we hope it leads not just to great conversation today, but to some concrete partnerships and dialogue along the way on the future road, and we hope that you would be a part of that. If this sparks your interest, please find us afterwards. We have some big plans in this area. So I also want to note that for your friends and colleagues who couldn't make it because of the snow or because they might be elsewhere, you'll notice that we're recording this, and we will be posting the session, and we'll circulate that email. And if you don't already get our center emails, you can go to the website and clbb.mgh.harvard.edu and sign up, and please spread the word. I want to begin by just a couple words of thanks. The center partners with the law school and the Petrie-Flom Center in Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics in a program on law and applied neuroscience. And this is one of a series of events we've run. I want to thank the center, in particular, faculty director Glenn Cohen, executive director Carmel Shakar, who's not here, Alex Perlman for getting all the media word out, and a special thanks to Dr. Christine Hutchison, who from the beginning in the poster to the final printing today has made this possible. Thank you as well, though they're not here, to our advisory board for the center. Some of you may be watching, and you make this possible with your leadership and support. So let me say just a couple words about the center. This is a new intersection, neurosciences law. As one of our federal judge friends has said in a publication, neuroscience and law are strange bedfellows. And I want to talk about that a moment. The center, as I mentioned, was founded by Dr. Edersheim and Dr. Price 10 years ago. It is a unique partnership between MGH, Harvard Medical School, and Harvard Law School. And the mission of the center from its founding and continue today is to generate system-wide changes in legal practice, legal doctrine, legal policy by integrating and applying neuroscience. And not just willy-nilly, but in a responsible, transformative, ethical way. We need to find areas where there are justice needs, and we need to fill that gap where it makes sense to do with science. The center, you should know, has already had a number of real-world impact stories, exonerating the wrongfully accused, winning clemency, and new considerations for those who've been overly harshly sentenced, especially juveniles, providing better rules for admissibility of certain types of scientific testimony. And as the center moves into its second decade, we're really turning our focus to part what you're going to hear today, the developing brain, and at the end of life, the aging brain. The consistent theme is that across the lifespan, we ought to ensure, really there ought to be a right to healthy brain development, free from coercion, abuse, neglect. We turn our attention today, and we're excited, to the U.S. immigration system. If you're here, you probably already know much about it, and you know that there is certainly a need for more justice. Here's the plan for today. Dr. Charles Nelson, who I'll introduce in a second, is going to walk us through the relevant neuroscience. Professor Cindy Zapata will walk us through the relevant legal context, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I'll ask a few questions as moderator, and then we'll encourage you to jump in as well. So take your notes, hold your questions till the end, but we will have time for them. Begin to see, can science play a role here? And if so, what? We have a really awesome panel, and I'll now do our panelist introductions. We'll first hear from Dr. Charles Nelson III. He is, I think, the nation's most distinguished neuroscientist and psychologist studying the effects of trauma and early childhood adversity on the developing brain. He is the Richard David Scott Chair in Pediatric Developmental Medicine Research at Children's Hospital Boston, where he directs the Laboratories of Cognitive Neuroscience. At Harvard, he is professor of, get ready for it, education, pediatrics in the Department of Society, Human Development, and Health, professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry. Too many awards to mention, but is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. Over the last 2 decades, his research has focused on a variety of things, including neurodevelopment and development and neural bases of memory, recognition and processing of objects, neuroplasticity, and he's going to talk to us today about some of his groundbreaking research, though it's too much for even us to hear all about today. He has at least 4 current projects, which I thought you'd be interested in knowing, and you'll learn more about them. One is focused on infants growing up in families in Boston that experience high levels of stress and adversity. A second is a long-running project which you may have heard of from Romania, focusing on children who are abandoned to state-run institutions in infancy. A third, focusing on infants and young children growing up in a slum in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And a fourth, focusing on infants in Puerto Rico who were infected with the Zika virus. So I want to thank Dr. Nelson for being with us today, and I also want to thank him for being in the public space and the public dialogue about these issues over the past year and for many years. Many neuroscientists are content to work in their lab. Dr. Nelson has been a vocal advocate for science in society, and we appreciate that. Following Dr. Nelson's presentation, we'll transition to begin asking, okay, the science is awesome, but what does that have to do with law? What can a practicing attorney actually do with that? What different policy might we have? And to help us answer those questions, Professor Cindy Zapata, clinical instructor in the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinical Program and supervising the HLS Immigration Project, will walk us through those details. Attorney Zapata was previously a litigation associate at Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed, where she engaged in a number of immigration-related cases, and at law school at UC Berkeley, interned with the Boston Immigration Court, and a clinical student at East Bay Community Law Center in Berkeley. She'll say more about this, but I do want to just mention, if you don't already know, that the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinical Program, HIRC, in partnership with their partner Greater Boston Legal Services, has been doing cutting-edge work in this area for many years, 3 decades, where it's needed most. The clinic is focused on direct representation of individuals applying for U.S. asylum and related protections, also involved in appellate and policy advocacy work at the local, national, and international levels, and focus on representation of individuals who survived a number of different types of trauma, domestic violence, and other crimes, or those who are facing forced removal in immigration proceedings. I also want to note, and I think we're going to hear from Professor Zapata about this, she led the first service trip of HLL students to work specifically on immigration work at the border. They worked at the Carnes Family Detention Center, and I know even just from our conversation before and from some of her writing that these were gripping and emotional moments. So I think today's program will be both powerful and passionate, and again, I would encourage you to jot down your notes, join in the conversation as we get to the end of the panel, and with that, please join me in welcoming to the stand Dr. Charles Nelson. Thanks, Dr.
So I'm delighted to be here, and I should say that I won't talk very much about trauma, but I'll talk about, excuse me, the meta issues that subsume trauma. But first, I need to give you a little bit of background. So here's an outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to just briefly give you a summary of brain development. Think of it as brain development for lawyers, the role of experience in brain development, and then I'm going to focus on the effects of adversity, particularly focusing on neglect and parent-child separation. So for those of you who haven't seen this, am I allowed to wander around without a mic? Can I? Okay, I'll do this. For those of you who haven't seen this, this is the dramatic changes that occur in brain development, mostly prenatally. So this is the brain 15 and a half weeks after conception, then 22 weeks, 23 weeks, 25 weeks. I put this in here because this is currently about the age of viability. That is the point at which neonatologists are required to try to save a baby born this early. Look at the dramatic difference between the brain at 25 weeks and just 2 weeks later, and then full-term brain and the adult brain. The point I'm making is that there are dramatic changes that occur that are regulated in part by genes, but the biggest changes occur postnatally that are driven by experience. And so this is designed to summarize the major, this is not working. First I stepped on the duct tape and got stuck, and now I can't move the microphone. Exactly, I'm just gonna grab onto this. These are the major stages in brain development. What I want to point out are these things here. So this is the process whereby the brain produces too many synapses, too many connections among neurons.
Excuse me. Let's put a lav on you and you can be where you want to be.
Got it. Thanks. So what this is saying is that we overproduce connections among neurons, and then through the process of experience, we prune these back to adult numbers. And this is showing that in areas involved in seeing and hearing, that peak occurs in the first months of life. In language areas, it's a little bit later, and in higher cognitive functions, emotion regulation, sophisticated thought, and the like, it's closer to a year. But you'll notice that this roll-off happens through the end of adolescence. And this is sort of anticipates a point I'm going to make in a minute about critical periods. So what this is saying is that the window of opportunity to influence the prefrontal cortex and these higher cognitive functions and emotion regulation occurs all the way through the teenage years, which is quite different than the critical periods involved in learning to see or to hear, which occur in the first few years. So what about the role of experience? So there are different aspects of experience that impact development. Healthy experiences should, in theory, facilitate healthy brain development, and conversely, adverse experiences can impact brain development in a very negative way. Timing matters. So adverse experiences will have different effects depending on their timing and their duration of exposure. So if those adverse experiences occur during those critical periods, it can have a particularly deleterious effect than if it happened before or after that critical period. If a child is exposed to adverse experiences during this critical period, then the brain is responsive to this experience, generally the first years of life, or if they pass through the critical period and they fail to get the experiences that are expected, caregiving, nutrition, things like that, then development is also derailed. So the point then is that if during a critical period bad things happen, that can derail development. Similarly, if you go through a critical period and the key developmental experiences fail to occur, like adequate caregiving, then development can also be derailed. So early experience matters. So this is a way, I borrowed this slide from my colleague Takao Hinch to illustrate what we mean by these critical periods. So this is saying that in sensory systems like seeing and hearing and motor systems and higher cognitive systems, there are different critical periods, different windows of opportunity for experience to influence the course of development. So a final point about experience is that brain plasticity changes with age. So in some domains, change is possible throughout the lifespan. Learning and memory is an example. For the few of you who've taken classes with me, you often hear me talk about my mother, plus I do that for Judy's sake as a psychiatrist. So my mother's 92, she uses an iPad, a cell phone, a computer. She now has this new Alexa device. She does call me 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 times a day because nothing is working. The fact is, for someone who grew up in her generation where there was no technology like this, she's actually learned to use this technology. That's quite different than domains like seeing and hearing. We don't learn to see better or to hear better. We can learn to listen better, right? But the point is that our visual systems, our auditory systems, our language systems all develop early and are not subject to experiential impact later on, unlike learning and memory. The ability to change the brain declines with age. This is the sobering statistic. This is showing how normal brain plasticity is influenced by experience and how it declines over time. And the reason for this is that the physiologic effort required to enhance neural connections increases astronomically. So the sheer effort, metabolic effort, for example, of making new connections and changing the brain increases asymptotically like this. You'll notice the crossover point is around here, so you can decide if you're on the left side of this graph or the right side of this graph, but the point is that it gets more and more difficult to shift the brain as you get older. One example is if you try to learn a new language as an adult, having no previous experience with other languages. If you decide to take up golf at the age of 50, it's good for the economy, spending a fortune on golf lessons, but it's probably not going to make you Tiger Woods. So, in summary, early experience matters. Atypical experiences or the lack of experiences like neglect during critical periods matters a lot. So, let's now turn to early adversity. And some experiences can be healthy and adaptive, and some can be toxic and negatively impact development. So, here's healthy and adaptive. These are kids that we'll hear more about in a few minutes being raised in orphanages, having been separated or abandoned by their parents early in life. There's a continuum of psychosocial adversities and a continuum of biological adversities. So for psychosocial adversities, we would have income disparities, parental education, housing conditions, stressful life events, parenting behaviors. The point is that this exists on a continuum. So we can have kids growing up in families that are great families or terrible families. We can have good housing, bad housing, or no housing. We can have stressful life events, such as children exposed to high levels of parental conflict, and parental education and income are also factors in psychosocial adversity. Severe psychosocial adversities include traumatic events. Think of what just happened in Alabama with the tornado, neglect, and physical and emotional neglect, maltreatment, physical and emotional maltreatment, and parental psychopathology. I want to come back to this in just a minute. So the point is that much the way there's a continuum of healthy development and healthy experiences, there's a continuum of adverse experiences. There's also biological adversities. So there is malnutrition, which can be micronutrient or macronutrient. There can be infection. This is actually a picture taken from my lab in Dhaka, just up the block. And environmental toxins like heavy metals, pollutants, and the like. So let me put this up and then step back and walk through this. Whoops. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but a few years ago, a postdoc in my lab and a medical student in my lab put this together as a conceptual framework for understanding the biological embedding of adversity. That is, when bad things happen, how do they get woven into your biology and your neurobiology to have a long-term impact? So here's an example of early childhood adversity. So we have deprived environments, adverse birth outcomes, infectious and non-infectious diseases, psychological stressors, and the like. What happens then is that these things interact with the individual's genetic endowment, right? So whatever the genes are that you've inherited from your parents and grandparents and the like, interact with these things. And then at the level of biology, we can have epigenetic changes, we can have neurodevelopmental disruptions, homeostatic system disruptions, and excess inflammation. These are simply ways that the biology of the organism is impacted by this interaction of experience and genes. So when it comes to genes, for example, we have genes that confer risk and genes that confer protection. A very good friend of mine just published a book on the orchid and dandelion model of development, where orchid children are like the flower. If raised under ideal conditions, will thrive, but if not ideal conditions, won't do so well. Dandelion children, on the other hand, on almost any condition will do okay. What influences that? So once these changes occur, they can shift developmental trajectories and lead to long-term impacts on social, emotional development, cognitive development, brain development, and the like. So let me give you, in broad relief, some examples of worldwide adversity. So the CDC has reported that roughly 1/3 of the world's children experience physical or harsh punishment or abuse under the age of 18. That the UN has estimated that 133 to 275 million children globally witness violence between primary caregivers. That 223 million children are victims of sex trafficking each year. 59% of children in developing countries have been victims of physical, emotional, or sexual violence, and this excludes corporal punishment, which, if you include that, jumps the figures. And finally, if we consider caregiving mental health, depression represents the leading cause of disease-related disability, at least based on WHO estimates. So that was the point I made earlier with one of those slides, that this is something that's often below the radar, but it's a significant issue of children being raised in families where moms have a depression. So what are the effects of adversity are long-lasting. There's an increased risk for both mental and physical health problems. It can range from anxiety and depression to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. It is theoretically possible for these effects to biologically cascade from one generation to another. And this is the epigenetic process I talked about earlier. So what that's saying is that if one generation is severely impacted by adversity, the offspring of that generation can be affected because of the sort of process of transmitting the genetic material that creates cells and like from one generation to another. And we have to keep in mind that the financial and human capital costs of society are enormous, given this backdrop that I've just talked about. So what happens when children are neglected or fail to receive adequate caregiving? And so I want to spend just a few minutes on this before I wrap up, because I think this is probably going to speak more directly to the focus of this group on trauma at the border. So why is neglect bad for the brain? So the brain expects input it doesn't receive, so its wiring is altered. That it's particularly egregious if these experiences that are expected to occur during a critical period or a sensitive period fail to occur. It can range from not access, you don't have patterned light. You could have cataracts, or you could be neglected and not, for example, be locked in a closet. Adequate sound, adequate language, adequate caregiving. So the point is that if these things occur during a critical period, then development is derailed, as I said earlier. So what do we know about kids who experience profound neglect? And as a neuroscientist, one way we've done this is to develop a model system. And one example of that are kids who experience institutional care, because it's an extreme form of neglect, and it allows us to isolate neglect and as distinct from, say, abuse and other forms of maltreatment. So we know that kids raised who experience profound neglect are at dramatically increased risk for a variety of cognitive, social, and behavioral problems, disturbances in social relatedness and attachment, externalizing behavior problems, inattention hyperactivity, deficits in IQ and executive functions, a syndrome that mimics autism, growth stunting, which I'll show you in just a minute. And these outcomes also apply to children in families who experience neglect. So some have said, well, these are extreme cases of kids experiencing profound neglect. But if you talk to people in child protection in the United States, for example, the outcomes are only slightly better than these kids. So this is not restricted to kids raised in profound deprivation. It also occurs in kids raised in family neglect and deprivation. So here's an example that some of you have seen me use before of growth stunting. This is a 17-year-old girl, and that's a 14-year-old girl. And the point is that this kind of growth stunting, which sometimes is referred to as psychosocial dwarfism, is not due to being malnourished. It's due to being emotionally deprived of caregiving, adequate caregiving. And kids lose about a month of linear growth for every month they spend in a severely neglectful home. So what do we know? So a high-level summary. This is drawing from work that two colleagues and I have been doing in Romania for now almost 20 years, as part of a randomized controlled trial looking at kids who were abandoned to an institution, and then after we studied them all, we placed half of them into a high-quality foster care program that we built and maintained and paid for, and the other half stayed in the institution. We did this because we only had so many foster care homes, so we weren't depriving kids of treatment. And then we had a comparison group of kids who live with their families in the city. So the brief version is that kids growing up in institutions from early in life, we're not talking about a 15-year-old who gets placed in an institution, but kids who are raised there from early in life. Reduced IQ, reduced language function, poor attachments, impairments in executive functions and peer relationships, higher rates of psychopathology, particularly attention deficit disorder and externalizing disorders. Kids that were placed in high-quality foster care have higher IQs, better language, better relationship building, lower rates of psychopathology, but the largest benefits were obtained among the kids placed before the age of 2. So that's the critical period issue. So although we see dramatic improvements in most domains in kids placed in foster care, the most dramatic improvements were observed among the kids placed at the youngest ages. So I'm just going to give you 2 examples of data, and then we're going to sort of tie things together. So what we can do before I put that slide up, is we want to know one index of brain development is to record the brain's electrical activity. So we place sensors on the head, and we simply record the brain's electrical activity when a child is really not doing anything. They're just sort of staring at something that grabs their attention. And we can look at the amount of brain activity that's being generated by the billions of neurons in the brain by simply looking at what we see at the scalp. So here what you're looking at is we can color code the amount of activity so that red represents more activity, yellow represents less activity. Think of this like a 60-watt bulb and a 100-watt bulb, or I guess now it would be a 12-watt bulb and a 14-watt bulb. I still can't get the new wattage straight. You're looking at a view from the top down. Front of the head, this is the nose, back, left ear, and right ear. This is before we assign kids to foster care. This is at baseline when they're all in the first 1 or 2 years of life. Notice how much less brain activity there is over the frontal lobe in the institutional group compared to the never institutional group. So this is like turning the dimmer switch down. Think of it that way. If you look at age 8, these are children in the institutional group. Again, tip of the nose, back of the head, left ear, right ear. And these are the kids placed in foster care after 2, and they're identical. These are the kids placed in foster care before 2, and these are the kids who've never been in an institution, and they're identical. So what that's telling us is that placement before 2 seems to lead to a normalization of brain activity. Placement after 2 seems to have no effect at all. The same effects we observe at 12 and 16 as well. So children in institutional care display deficits in brain activity compared to kids who've never been in an institution. Children who receive the foster care intervention continue to show typical levels of brain activity through age 16. So the age of placement in foster care is associated with much better outcomes. Lastly, we want to look at the stress response. And the reason is that there's ample evidence that children who experience profound neglect and also trauma have a dysregulated response to stress. In other words, when you're looking at the students, if you're going to take an exam, an appropriate response would be to be anxious, to be stressed. Maybe your palms sweat a little bit, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, and things like that. Those are normative responses to a stressor. But there's some evidence from animals and from humans to indicate, excuse me, that children who experience profound neglect and other forms of adversity don't show that normative response. So here's what we did. We asked the kids, this is at age 8, but we've done this at every age as they got older, to deliver a speech about what makes a good friend, and to do that in front of 2 teachers they've never met. Now, they weren't really teachers, but they were adults who looked like teachers. And so imagine, this is me here in the spotlight giving this talk. And during that time, we're recording my blood pressure, my heart rate, my cortisol response, and the like. And so those are the things we record. So the first thing to notice is that this stands for the Trier stress test. This is when you're giving the speech. What we're seeing is that for the kids in the never institutional group, they show a great big court response. You just release more cortisol when you're stressed. But there's no difference in foster care versus institutional care. And at first glance, that was disheartening, right? Because we thought we would see an intervention effect. But when you divide the kids in foster care into placement before and after 2, you see a perfectly normative stress response for the kids placed before 2 compared to the kids placed after 2. So, children placed in foster care under 2 years of age show a normative stress response. Kids placed after that do not. So, the effects of early adversity, including neglect, can have far-reaching consequences on brain, biological, and psychological development. As a rule, the early in life the adversity begins, and the longer it lasts, the more profound the effects. And if we want to reduce the burden of disease, physiological, biological, behavioral, in adults, we should take steps to address children growing up in adverse circumstances. So how do we translate this science for policy? So let's see if we can bring this home to the situation of trauma at the border and kids being separated. So I show this slide to you with some reluctance because no matter how many times I've seen this activates my stress response system. This is a little kid who was separated from his parents at the border, and this is when they've been reunited.
Yo me vine por ti, mi amor, y me... Papi, papi, vete, mi amor, yo me vine por ti. Yo no me Mi hijo está traumado,
So we spend a lot of time thinking about the effects of these separations on kids, but also look at the mother's reaction to the separation, and then think how this can cascade ahead so that how will this dyad come together again in a healthy way as time goes by. So another point to make is roughly last May, Margaret Sheridan, who's a former postdoc of mine, is now a professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. We wrote this op-ed for the New York Times that we titled How to Turn Children into Criminals. Now, we didn't do this to get attention. We did this based on data. So there is a type of psychopathology called callous unemotional traits, which refers to sort of the callous disregard for the emotional well-being and feelings of others. And some speculate it may be a precursor to psychopathy, another psychopathic personality. In the data from Romania, we see, particularly among boys, the kids in the institutional group, 35% of them show evidence of callous unemotional traits. But you notice it drops dramatically for the kids in foster care. So what this is telling us, based on this study, is that that kind of separation and isolation and neglect of kids, particularly if it's left to continue, can shift kids in a direction of behaviors that are really not suited to be integrated into society. And we're already hearing stories at the border about kids who are, well, I'll show you some examples in a minute, that are showing the expected response to prolonged separations from their caregivers. So if we do a view from above, there are powerful lessons for the millions of children around the world who've experienced maltreatment and or forceful and prolonged separation. These are some things that I pulled down recently that are in the news. This is the new one that I found. I actually, when I was doing a lot of media interviews last year, I said that this was a risk factor, and now, of course, there are lots of reports of sexual abuse against these kids. And I bring this slide to your attention because here's a little girl being separated at the border. This is one of the detention centers in Texas. My memory is it's a Texas town of 4,000 with 2,500 kids living in detention. And this is a Romanian orphanage, and I think that we can see parallels across that. So the bottom line is we should learn from the science, that we should inform policymakers, politicians, and clinicians about the short and long-term effects of adversity, but in particular, that early and prolonged adversity can have lifelong effects on both psychological and physical development, that the duration of time spent in adversity powerfully influences the course of development, that the age the child is when they're removed from the adverse environment will influence the outcome, and that forceful separation of kids from parents elevates the risk of adverse outcomes for both children and parents. So on that note, I'll stop and stop. Thank you. Cindy, you don't need the laptop, right? All yours. Sorry.
Thank you all. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the legal process is like when someone is in detention, and then talk about how, as attorneys, the approach that we're taking to trauma and our clients who are traumatized, and what we do here at the clinic in order to train students and address how we work with that trauma. So just to give a little bit of background about what the process is at the border, when someone crosses the border and is taken by CBP or ICE, they're going to go through a process that that has a couple of different avenues. One of the options is if someone expresses that they have a fear of going back to their country of origin. And I'll talk about that path in 1 second, but if they don't express any fear, say that what they say when asked, why did they leave their country, they said, I need a better life for my child, I need a better life for myself, then they're going to go through a process known as expedited removal, and they're going to be deported. And in that process, they don't ever see a judge. They simply go through low-level immigration officers and are deported by CBP. Now, if someone expresses that they do have a fear of going back to their home country, then they're supposed to be given the option of getting a credible fear interview. And what that interview is supposed to do is assess basically the reasons why they came here, the fear that they have in coming. And it's based on a standard known as significant possibility. They need to show a significant possibility that if they were to be given a full hearing before an immigration judge, they could have a successful case on the merits. And that determination is based on the definition of an asylee, of a refugee. So someone needs to show that they have a fear of going back to their country due to past persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of 5 different reasons: their nationality, their religion, their political opinion, their membership in a particular social group, or their race. And as you can imagine, telling why you're scared and having it fit within those very 5 narrow groups is difficult. This whole process generally is a difficult process, and to navigate that process, without having a lot of knowledge is extremely difficult. So if someone is found to have a credible fear, then they are generally allowed to be released from detention and pursue their case here in the United States. But even after being released into the United States, they still have to go to immigration court and prove the entire merits of their case. So their case is only that first step in order for them to have their day in court. And even at this point, say they are released, they're spending weeks to months in detention waiting for that determination. Now, if someone is not found credible, say they have a fear and they couldn't necessarily fit it within that particular social group, what we're finding is that a lot of people are sharing their fear, but if it's not perfectly articulated, then they're being denied that finding of credible fear. And if they're found to have a negative determination, then they're given the option of getting an appeal before the immigration judge. Now, this process is supposed to take place within 24 to 7 days from their moment of appealing. But generally, something that we saw when we were at the Carnes Detention Center was that people were waiting for months. We had one father in particular who had been waiting for more than 90 days. And so at this point, he had been in detention with his small child for months. And in that process, we were finding that it's extremely difficult for someone. There are so many issues with the process of appeal, aside from the very obvious ones of interpretation issues, especially with fathers that we encountered. We encountered a lot of fathers and sons that had interpretation issues because their first native language was an indigenous language. Now, if the immigration judge agrees with the asylum officer, so agrees that they do not have a credible finding, then that person will now go through the process of expedited removal and they will be deported. This was already after months of waiting for their day in court. And then many of the fathers that we encountered were so desperate at this point because they had waited so long. And even in those hearings, there were so many additional issues that I'll get to in just 2 seconds. But one thing to highlight is that, if the judge disagrees with them and finds that the asylum officer agrees with the asylum officer, there's only one more option where they can make a petition to the asylum office to request a new interview. And as you can see, a lot of this process, many of the fathers didn't know how to read or write, were mentally, emotionally, physically, psychologically exhausted, and a lot of this process was almost impossible to attain if they didn't have the assistance of an attorney. Now, if the judge disagrees with the asylum officer and finds that they do have a credible fear, then they're generally allowed to be released from detention and then pursue their case in the United States. And again, they still have to go through the full merits of their case. And so the only one note I'll add is that again, this process is a little complicated, and if someone has been deported already before, then they're going to go through a similar process known as a reasonable fear interview, and where the standard is a little higher, and they have to prove that they would fit the definition of an asylee more likely than not. So issues with this process. So aside from the most obvious one is that people are in detention, children are in detention. You know, while we were at the Carnes Detention Center, we very much saw children as young as 3 years old in detention. And it's a process that's, you know, there's nothing really that can prepare you for seeing a child in detention. Nothing really that can prepare you to see children not being allowed to color while they're having an attorney visit with you. The lack of representation. The truth is there are not enough immigration attorneys that can help represent all of these people in immigration detention. There are a lot of attorneys that are doing their best and a lot of incredible organizations that are working their hardest. But the truth is there's not enough, right? The system, there's too many people and not enough attorneys. Lack of due process. It's a legal system, and you'd expect to see due process rights being protected, right? People's basic rights. If someone goes into a court hearing and doesn't speak the language of the proceedings, one would assume that the court would provide an interpreter for that individual to go on with the proceeding, especially when the stakes are so high and the determination is matter of life or death. But we constantly saw fathers, especially people who were from indigenous backgrounds, that spoke indigenous dialects or languages, that were just completely denied that right. There was one situation in particular that comes to mind of a student and a colleague of mine who were representing an indigenous man who had been in detention for months at this point with his small child. And they were going to represent the individual via video conference. They had their papers ready, and despite their assertions and the client's assertion that he was represented and wanted to continue with the case with their attorneys, they were denied access to him, and he was denied access to their attorneys. Despite him saying on the record, Spanish is not my first language, I do not understand this language well, the judge determined that it was sufficient and proceeded with the hearing in Spanish, where the man was clearly not even able to understand or explain or express the fear and horrible situation that he had suffered in his own language. There's a lack of recognition in adjudicators generally about the trauma that people go through. By the time individuals get to detention, there are so many different layers of trauma. Many of these people grow up in extreme poverty and in extreme adversity. And so we're already seeing so much of what, you know, has been discussed before of how much trauma they're already going through just to survive in life. And then to go through the process of coming up to the U.S. border is so difficult. It's an arduous journey. It is one that is not done easily or lightly. And it's extremely traumatic. It's a time of lack of food, lack of sleep, making it here just to get another opportunity. And then you're in detention, and you're there for months with terrible conditions, medical, food, and a lack of hope, a lack of actual access to resources. So by the time that we were seeing clients, there were so many different layers of trauma that made it such a challenge to work with them, to try to help them understand the system. Now, if a parent exhausts all of these options and they're still not found to be credible in their fear, then their child has the option of going through the process by themselves without their parents. However, in my short experience at Carnes, it was seldom that a child ever wanted to leave their parent alone, that they wanted to let their parent be deported and them go through the process themselves. One particular experience that comes to mind was that of a 16-year-old boy. He had been separated from his father, and I was asked to explain to him the process and that he had an option, if he wanted to stay and continue with his case. And despite expressing that he did not want to go back, that he was going to face harm, that he was going to face even death, he was like, I cannot leave my father. I cannot bear the fact of being separated from him. And as a 16-year-old boy, he completely unraveled in front of me. And it was hard to imagine that for a 16, he was 16, only the effects of how it's affecting children of all ages. And it was an impossible decision for him to make. Now, if a child crosses alone, then they go through a separate process for unaccompanied minors, and that they go through the ORR. And I know we've seen a lot of that in the news, and in particular, those conditions are horrific. There are a lot of human rights violations, a lot of sexual abuse happening at these detention centers where children are being held, and we can see an example of that with Tornillo. So that's, in a nutshell, what the process is like when someone comes into detention and is trying to seek asylum at the border. And this whole process that we understand now is being challenged with this whole waiting in Mexico for your asylum case. Currently, the wait in Mexico is being applied to the Tijuana border, but there is talk of it being expanded to the other ports of entry. And we have seen recently that Mexico is also stepping up their efforts to try to prevent people seeking asylum from crossing into the United States or even getting to the U.S. border. So how do we see, how as practitioners, as attorneys, do we see trauma, and how are we trying to handle it? So trauma generally makes the process for applying for asylum extremely difficult, or for any humanitarian protection in the United States, extremely difficult for several reasons. For starters, it's often difficult for people to talk about the most horrific things that have happened in their life. And these experiences, many of which people are making an active effort to suppress them, to forget them, in order so that they can move on with their lives and go forward. But in order to pass a credible fear interview, in order to get asylum in a hearing, these people have to actually talk about every single detail of this horrific horror in extreme consistency. And as a result, one of the key roles of an immigration attorney is to elicit these horrible facts that individuals have gone through. And our job of building rapport and trust with our clients becomes only that much harder. Generally, it's difficult with the trauma that people suffer because they've already suffered so much trauma of which forced them to leave in the first place. And in the family detention setting, it was only that much harder. Because you were adding the separation of a child, of a parent, to the situation. We found that fathers, again, had been pushed to the absolute limit, mentally, physically, emotionally, psychologically, where even though they had viable claims, they couldn't bear the thought of being in detention for one day longer. They couldn't bear the fact of seeing their child grow sick and depressed in the detention center one day longer. The father of the 16-year-old son that I had spoken to earlier, he was just like, look at him. He's sick. I can't keep him here anymore. We have to get out of here. And both of them were very aware that the situation back home for them was dire, was deadly, but they just could not bear the fact, the father couldn't bear the fact of seeing his child continue to go through the trauma of being in detention. It was also difficult because the system was constantly changing, it was extremely difficult to give people realistic expectations. And that only added another challenge to the whole representation of individuals. We couldn't realistically give them expectations of how long things were taking, of what was going to happen, because the system was literally changing every single day. And it created a lot of despair in the fathers and children that we spoke to. In addition, the legal process, adjudicators, the immigration system as a whole, it doesn't take trauma into account. Again, as I was mentioning earlier, these individuals have to tell their story with extreme consistency. Any inconsistency, no matter how small or immaterial, is used against them to attack their credibility by the government. And so you can imagine, there's an understanding that if anyone's going to be going through traumatic experiences, one, it's going to be very difficult to be talking about these experiences. Two, it's going to be very difficult to talk about these experiences with insane consistency each and every time, because for many different reasons of the fact that, people are trying to forget these things that have happened to them. So it's going to be extremely difficult. And the process of an asylum hearing is extremely taxing on an individual. Again, aside from talking to us, and we take time to build rapport with our clients, we take time to understand the effects of trauma, we take time to try to work with them. And at the clinic, we're very fortunate to have a social worker that we have on staff with us that's part of our legal team that we consult with, and we have our students consult with. and that is also there to meet with the clients, to help them through the process, to help them cope through the process. But on the day of the asylum hearing, they're literally sharing their most horrific experiences with a room of complete strangers, strangers that will make the determination of whether they get to stay here or whether they have to return to the conditions, to the fear that caused them to leave in the first place. And although attorneys may have an understanding of what the trauma, of how trauma is affecting our clients, and take our time, it can't be. The same isn't said for adjudicators, for immigration judges, for the government attorneys. And we see evidence of this even in some structural elements within the immigration law. Again, the requirement, the demand that clients have to share their story with complete consistency, as well as the 1-year filing deadline. For example, someone needs to file for asylum within 1 year of arriving here in the United States, which again completely erases the fact that when people come here that first year, maybe there's so many things that they're working through, right? They're working through the mental, emotional, psychological scars that they're going through, while at the same time also trying to provide for their family, trying to provide for their children. And although there are exceptions, which include PTSD, we find that in order to access that exception, that option, a psychological evaluation is going to be needed, and really the assistance of an attorney is going to be needed. And so just to give a little bit about how our clinic addresses trauma and how we try to train students is that, we teach about trauma in our classes and its effects on a person in our clinic and in our seminar. And we try to give a space for students to understand how trauma is affecting our clients. We try to explain to them that sometimes that process of working through an asylum a case can in effect re-traumatize many of our clients, and it could be an extremely difficult process for them, a process that they, although understand that it's very important, may not want to engage because it raises so much emotional and psychological harm. We have students collaborate with our social worker and the social work interns in order to provide a holistic approach to lawyering to our clients. And we also recognize that this work may be very difficult for students and may affect students through secondary trauma. And as a result, we've tried to incorporate students to meet with the social worker in our clinic to also to see how the work is affecting them and to give them tools on how to address and recognize those symptoms. And lastly, I'll just talk a little bit about our trip down to the detention center. Taking students down to the Carnes Detention Center was an extremely difficult experience. And if you want to hear from the students about their experience, they've written a great blog about it that can be found on our website. But beyond seeing small children locked up in prison, it's seeing our system just not represent or fail to protect the people that it's supposed to protect is an extremely devastating experience. And to see that flagrant disregard for human and due process rights is extremely painful. And for me, it was particularly difficult. I'm sure it was for all of you seeing those videos and those pictures and those images of children. As a parent, you can't help but think, like, I can't imagine how a parent has to go through these experiences generally. And for me, when I came back, it was very difficult to interact with my small son, knowing that I'd never have to go through that experience myself. And it was very difficult to acknowledge that we're going through our life daily while there are children and parents in detention at this very moment. And so it was an extremely difficult experience, as you can imagine. And it was very difficult for our students. You're taught to acknowledge that we live in a legal system and that people are supposed to be protected and their rights are supposed to be protected. And to not see that happen is extremely, it's horrible. And so we tried in that experience, when we all came back, we recognized that it was a difficult experience for all of us, and we tried debriefing, and we had students meet together to give that a space where we could talk about how this all was affecting us, and to meet with the social worker in our clinic to try to make sense of it all. But the students are having given up on this. Despite the experience, students are still committed. They're still working at it, and this spring break, a group of them are going to detention centers over spring break to help people in need. And so despite the challenges of the current times, there's a huge importance as us as attorneys to recognize the trauma that we see in our clients, to recognize the trauma that we see in their children, and to give them that opportunity to have holistic lawyering, to really, as difficult as that process may be, to enable them to make it as less painful as possible for them, because no part of it is going to be an easy process. And really a policy change that needs to, in my opinion, be something seen as adjudicators really taking into consideration the trauma that these individuals are going through, and to recognize it in these proceedings. But despite the challenges of these current times, there is huge importance in staying connected and staying engaged and continuing the work that we're doing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, for those powerful remarks. Thank you, Dr. Nelson, for yours. In just a minute, we'll come up to the panel and take your questions. I just want to offer a few thoughts processing what's been going on here. It's a very powerful moment. The lab that I run, our motto is every story is a brain story, and one of the things we believe very strongly is that you have a right to tell your own brain story, and clearly that's just not the case here. I think there's so much to do. I'm sure we're sitting here all very passionate about the challenges ahead, and we would like to snap our fingers and make this go away, even from what we've just seen today. But in an adversarial system, as Cindy recommended, there are people on the other side who don't want to change this, indeed who are attacking credibility, who don't see any of the science really that Dr. Nelson put up. And I think that leads to what now I hope we'll talk about. Is there a connection between these two talks that you just heard? And what is it? I think that's a challenging question, but to me, and I think to our center, that's a question we need to dive into. I'll just leave you with these thoughts as we come up, and maybe we can both come up to the panel. Now, the center is working on redefining its mission, and one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is better decisions aligned with science, leading to better outcomes aligned with justice. It's really a justice-driven center and a justice-driven mission, and I hope that comes up through our questions. I'm going to do one footnote and then move to the note. I noticed that Judge Gertner is here. Judge Gertner teaches one of the nation's only law and neuroscience classes where these discussions happen regularly, and I want to thank Dr. Nelson for coming to that class. So if you're a student here at HLS and you're really intrigued by this, you should take the class and think about these issues, how they permeate the justice system. But if I can ask the first question, and then I'll join you, and Dr. Nelson, this is for you. You mentioned that this, I think the phrase you used, can be woven into the biology of the brain. What are the prospects for whether the verb is unweaving or responding to? Ideally, there's an intervention before age 2 and this different path, but if we can't get there until age 8 or age 12 or age 16, what should we be advocating for?
What kind of plasticity exists later in the lifespan? And so I think we know from psychiatry and psychology that the efficacy of psychotherapy, for example, in adults can be very effective as a treatment for all sorts of psychological issues. So that speaks to the issue that there continues to be plasticity in some systems, that we can efficaciously treat depression and anxiety and other disorders. The more troublesome part is the biology part. So the way we have to think of this is that if you fundamentally alter biology in one direction, say in a bad direction, can you reshift it in another? And the answer is yes, and here's an example. I'm used to writing on Blackboard, so I'm looking around for a Blackboard. So we have 23 chromosomes, and the cap of our chromosome is called the telomere region. Just stay with me, this won't last long. And as our cells divide, you scratch yourself, you make a new skin cell, things like that, the telomere region gets eroded a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. Turns out psychological distress and stress generally can also accelerate telomere erosion. And the concern is that over the long term, if telomeres get short enough, that cell no longer can function and won't make a new healthy cell. There's some very interesting work in kids in foster care who show that kids who are still being maltreated show shortened telomeres, but if they're put into high quality foster care, their telomeres get longer. So there is a reversible aspect to this. We just have to better understand it. So what I want to leave you with is that there is both neurobiological and biological plasticity in many systems that can continue through the lifespan. But what we have to emphasize is that the longer you wait to do those interventions, the harder it's going to be to get things back on even keel.
Attorney Spada, one question for you, and then we'll open it up. And there's a microphone in the middle, so when you're ready, you can step in the middle. You talked about the need to articulate fear and the challenge of doing that. Just so we get a sense, what would that look like? What would an adjudicator hear? Stories? Are there? What does the evidence look like? Are there experts? It sounds like maybe not. Like just what would someone hear if they're trying to evaluate someone's articulation of fear claim?
So at the credible fear interview level, it's a low standard, and there is at least an acknowledgement that people have just made it to the border, so they don't necessarily need to provide evidence. It's really their testimony. And I think what we see is, really depends on the asylum officer how much they're going to go into the story to determine whether someone fits the definition of an asylee or not. There are some broad questions. Why did you leave your country? And people are supposed to describe there what happened to them. And again, without necessarily having a lot of follow-up from the asylum officer, it's very difficult to know what you're supposed to say or the purpose of that interview. And in particularly with the fathers and children that we saw, we reviewed a lot of their credible fear interviews, and the asylum officers were trying to understand why they left, and they were the whole interview was literally riddled with, do you know where my son is? Can you help me find my son? How long will it be till I get to see my son? And a lot of them were found to have negative findings because they couldn't express their fear in that interview because they were traumatized from being separated from their children.
Thank you. Let me invite you to the questions. I just want to ask one while you're getting lined up. Dr. Nelson, a lot of your data were group averaged data, so pictures of a group of kids and others. What's the state of the art in terms of individualized evaluation if one of the children at the border or adult? What can we say about individuals at this point?
So, that's sort of a burgeoning area of research that's benefited both from genetics and from psychology, so that we've always known there are individual differences, and the question is, how do we explain them? So it turns out that if you have certain genetic polymorphisms, that is, unusual combinations of genes, some combinations seem to confer an advantage and others a risk factor. So the other thing, if we do this simply behaviorally, we know that there are certain protective factors. So an example, kids experiencing profound neglect like the ones I talked about, if in fact some caregiver who stood up for that kid, in our country, for example, it could be a teacher or a pastor or a relative, even under horrific circumstances, someone to provide that buffering relationship seems to protect that child from, to some degree, from considerable harm. So we know there are things that we can, in a sense, intervene on to increase the chance that more kids will wind up thriving. Still, there are things that are so horrific, and as you were talking, I was thinking about this, that we shouldn't expect many kids to really thrive under those circumstances. If you never water a plant, eventually it succumbs to lack of water, and so that's sort of the model.
If you can state your name and your affiliation and start.
Hi, my name is Stephen Kasperick, and I'm currently a lab manager in the Stress and Development Lab with Dr. Katie McLaughlin in GSAS. And I think this question is more geared towards you, Dr. Nelson, but I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about either findings that have looked at this, or if you have research that's looked at this, what the unique effects might be of being separated from a parent versus being institutionalized from birth. I could imagine there might be kind of unique exertions on psychosocial adjustment or emotional well-being, and particularly as it relates to kind of the callousness that you spoke about, if you have not only a separation from parents, so you're experiencing the neglect, but there also may be this layer of hostility owing to the current political climate as well, and just the process of being detained, how that might influence that.
So there's no doubt that early and prolonged separation those kids have the worst outcomes. So then a question I got a lot about a year ago is, well, what if it's a 3-year-old who's separated for a month? What are the effects here? What about 2 months? What about 5 years? And there's no data to speak to this. And so as a result, all we can say is that the earlier it occurs and the longer it lasts, the more we should expect bad outcomes, leaving aside the fact that there are individual differences. I think there's a fundamental difference between kids being separated generally and being raised in an institution. But the other side to this is a forceful separation, which is what's going on at the border. It's one thing, so I also work in Brazil, and there, because of often drugs, parents will give up their kids, or they're removed from home by judges. That's different than a parent and a child who wants to be together, and they're forced apart. And I think Katie, to be transparent, Katie McLaughlin was a postdoc with me. I think Katie may be studying some of those separations. I'm not positive. And so we don't have any data to speak to that. But if we were to speculate, I think a 6-month-old, I'm going to qualify this in a minute based on something you said. I think a 6-month-old separated for a few months won't suffer the same consequences as a 2-year-old separated for a few months. A teenager might thrive even more, except for the fact that the abuse that goes on in these detention centers. So then they can deal with the attachment issue. So now to come back to the way you started the question, the way we think of this is that if a child has formed a solid relationship with a loving, caring caregiver, they're more likely to be able to withstand some degree of separation. But what I was most troubled about in these early reports is these kids are often leaving countries with high degrees of trauma exposure, right? So, and then they've had this arduous journey to the border, and then they're separated. So it's one thing after the other, and all of those things, I think, increase the risk that the separation alone is going to be compounded by these other traumatic events.
Hi, Güneş Sevinç from Mass General Hospital, postdoctoral research fellow at Division of Psychiatric Neuroscience. I think my question is to Cindy Zapata. As a neuroscientist, I'm very curious, what are the questions, what are the pressing questions that may help, if you find the answers to those questions, that may help you build your case more?
I missed the last part. That will help you what?
Build the case against trauma at the border.
Is it what kind of questions we ask the client, or
as scientists we can answer?
I see.
Sort of thing.
Got it.
What would you ask? If you
Yes.
have a wish list for neuroscience.
Wish list. It would be great for adjudicators to recognize research that shows that people who experience a lot of trauma have difficulty expressing that trauma, expressing that event, expressing it in specific detail and with ultimate consistency. I think showing that it takes time for people to open up, and that's not something that we can necessarily put a number, that it's not going to take certain months or days. Every person's different, and that will depend on each person's time. And I think, research to show that this is something that just because there are inconsistencies, it doesn't mean someone's not telling the truth. It doesn't mean that they're not being honest, or that their trauma isn't real, or that the harm isn't real. It just means that everyone processes harm differently in order to cope and survive in this day-to-day life. Yeah. Thank you.
As you're coming up, can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
Is it your sense that there are some actors in the legal system that don't think it's as bad as I think we might think it is? That is to sort of wave it off, and there's an adversarial process. I mean, there are some on various sides or adjudicators who just don't recognize the.
Sure, I think there's a there's a spectrum. There are some that may acknowledge it to a degree, and there are some that just really don't acknowledge it. I definitely saw during my time at Carnes a judge just look at the previous testimony and be like, well, why is it inconsistent now? And just didn't find them credible, you know.
Hi, I'm Anna Kulian. I'm one of Professor Nelson's students and also in Judge Gertner's class. I'm curious about the power of neuroscience. It feels so obvious that neglecting children is bad, separating them at the border is bad. And I'm curious about how can neuroscience actually change policy? Does it have the power to do that? If we have the things like how things are right now is so bad and it feels obvious, and I'm wondering, like, does neuroscience have the power to like move that forward and change people's minds?
You go first.
So I think the broader issue is not just neuroscience, but science generally, right? So we're living in a time where there's, let's just say, some skepticism about the role of science. After Margaret Sheridan and I published this op-ed, I received a lot of emails, and in fairness, the vast majority were, very good to read. But I got a couple that, one in particular that I thought I'd actually have to report to the FBI, and it was someone who they didn't care about the science. It was entirely a political issue for them. And so I think the worry I have is that I can give you lots of examples of where I think neuroscience could help the legal system, and we've talked about this many times. But the question is, are the policymakers receptive to data? And as you were talking, I was thinking of all the ways, I probably shouldn't say this, but all the ways I would love to help you, except that in front of a judge, that a judge requires that they describe in great detail consistently. And one thing we know about trauma victims is that the stories are going to change every time you tell it. So there's no basis of science of doing that. So I do worry a little bit about this falling on deaf ears. And maybe it's just we're going through a period where I'm just depressed about this. But I do think we would agree that there's lots of data for neuroscience that would help these issues. The question is, Judge Gertner's behind her, so I better hurry up. The question is anyone listening? Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, and it's a great question. If I can just add to it, there are other areas of law and neuroscience where the same question is being asked, and it is a long, slow slog. So I share your sort of concern, but I will say that I think Judy and Bruce would agree with me. We see some light at the end of the tunnel, and it's a combination of concerted effort, extremely strong research grounded, and these sorts of interactions, which have really been the seed for some substantial work. Juvenile justice is probably the primary example where we didn't need neuroscience to say that, hey, we shouldn't lock kids up for the rest of their lives for a small felony, but we needed that, and maybe Judge Gardner will talk to that as one of these routes. So just set up for you, Judge.
No, well, I wanted to address the political problem. Look at the difference between the way we talk about trauma in sexual assault cases now, where people are trying to understand how a victim of sexual assault could tell an inconsistent story. So part of the reason why we don't pay attention to it now at the border is the political problem, which is that we basically dehumanize these people. So I have another question, which is I wonder whether the science can speak to what happens to the kids when they're deported back to their communities. What kind of public safety issues are they raising in the communities in which they live? And that may be a way of changing the conversation so that you say, we have to pay attention to this, whether or not you're bleeding for these kids as you should. But even if you don't bleed for them in the way we're treating them, consider the impact when they return. Since Dr. Nelson has talked in my class, and we've talked together about the impact of trauma on gang violence that I dealt with as a judge. So if we can change the lens to look, not to change, but widen the lens to look at what happens at that end, then even the people who don't give a damn about the people we're dealing with might say, this just doesn't make sense as social policy.
Let me make sure I'm tracking one thing. So are you saying that the conversation we're going to turn to is the situations these kids find themselves in if they were to be
Right.
returned. But why do you think that that would have a beneficial impact right now in the conversation we're having in this country?
Well, if, for example, I don't know, well, actually, either kids who are finally after this process come to the U.S., what are they like and what will their lives be like? And those who are returned, what are they like and what will their lives like? Because, again, this is sort of politics. Is this contributing to the gang problem in Costa Rica or what, not in Costa Rica, but in Honduras, et cetera? Is this contributing to social dislocation in countries which can ill afford it? Is this exacerbating the trauma at that end? Then it becomes a public safety issue and not just a human issue. Sadly, we have to turn it into a public safety issue and not an issue of humanity, because for some, that's not part of the conversation.
That's interesting, because I'm thinking that if we could convince people that by returning these kids to their home country, that they're more likely to engage in criminal activity and join gangs and all that. But maybe this is just the depressogenic state of my being, but I keep thinking, but most Americans wouldn't care. It's another country, and what does that have to do with America?
Well, unless we can talk about, I don't know the answer. Maybe we can talk about the extent to which that then will bleed into our borders as well.
That's right. So there's that. And then there's the generational changes. We're going to take an entire generation of kids and elevate the risk of serious concerns with entering into the fabric of society. But that assumes that we're taking the long view, and that's what I'm also worried about. So, Judy, we need to talk after this.
We do. Is depressogenic a word?
I'm bringing up the rear to cheer all of you up.
Well,
why don't we go ahead? Yeah.
well, just one thing on policy change. I think, as we can tell, there's a lot of things that seem unattainable. But one thing that I think that Congress could maybe think about is just eliminating the one-year filing deadline. Is eliminating the one-year filing deadline. There are exceptions that recognize post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma as being an exception to the one-year filing deadline, and I think just eliminating that as a bar to applying for asylum generally, acknowledges the trauma that people are going through.
My name is Mary Peeler. I'm a student at the public health school, and I'm also a medical student going into obstetrics and gynecology. And I was wondering, as you were giving your presentation, Dr. Nelson, about childhood trauma, the research that's being done on pre-delivery trauma, prenatal trauma, and Ms. Zapata, if you could also talk about if you saw pregnant women at the border. I've heard sort of case reports, and what does it look like for those children growing up who are traumatized even before they're born? And in light of the other questions, I think if there's anything that conservatives in this country care about, it's protecting fetuses. So if that lens could be another lens through which we could have this conversation, it could widen the field of who's interested in it. Thanks.
Well, in our time there, the detention center strictly, they were only housing fathers and children. So in our time, we just worked with fathers and sons.
So that was incredibly insightful, the last thing you said about the protecting fetuses. So there's growing evidence that pregnant women experiencing high levels of stress, that crosses the placental barrier. It has any number of effects on development. What we don't know is what if those things are eliminated from the child's world after they're born? Can you make up for that? My intuition is no, that there are going to be a cascade of cellular and epigenetic-like changes that occur prenatally that will continue. But I do think changing the conversation to protect fetuses is a clever one. And I think added to yours, Nancy, that might be an interesting tack to take. But the question is, what's the prevalence of women arriving at the border pregnant? And then what safeguards are being put in place to protect them? Let me give an example of that, and it ties to something that was said earlier. So I was giving a talk in Mexico last year to new legislators in the federal government. And it turns out that in many states, they had this policy. They thought it would be a good idea for incarcerated women to have their kids with them. So in these prisons, lots of women have their kids. So it turns out that they often use their kids as shields during fights. And they asked me, well, what's better, to have a child raised in prison or have them separated from their mother and raised in an institution? And I thought, I don't want to think about that. Neither is a good option. So there are, it turns out, lots of situations where women give birth in prison, and then they care for those children in prison. That can't be a good thing, and it's awfully like a detention center, right? So I don't know.
Hi, I'm Stephanie DeCross. I'm a PhD student in clinical psychology with Kate McLaughlin in the Stress and Development Lab. First, thank you for all your work and willingness to speak in this kind of setting. In our lab, we do a lot of thinking about different dimensions of trauma, so primarily abuse versus neglect and how that differentially impacts brain development. So I was wondering from both of you how forceful separation and what's happening at the border might fit into or across these two different domains, and how we might expect, or maybe it's perhaps a unique impact on brain development, how we might expect neural outcomes to relate with this, or how we might interface with the legal system when we treat people and how we're dealing with people on these two different dimensions. Thank you.
I'll tackle the brain part if you tackle the first part about neglect versus abuse with those kids.
I mean, in our time that we were there, I think it was, you know, in the children that we spoke to, there were a lot of different layers. I think about one son in particular who had he was an indigenous boy, and he had already gone through a lot of abuse as being an indigenous boy. And so, you know, part of his claim was helping him understand that it wasn't his fault, right? That he was allowed to speak about these things because they were things that shouldn't happen to anybody. And then on top of that, I think for, you know, a lot of the kids kind of wrestled with the fact that, like, you know, was it their parents' fault, or, you know, why were they in this situation? Not many some had difficulty understanding, as anyone would, like, why they were in this position, why they were even separated in the first place. And all I can really speak to is just how their stories would come out in that type of moment. You know, it was a mixture of just not wanting to be here anymore and being upset at the whole situation, at the fact that they were even here in the first place, at the fact that they were still in detention, and with the abuse that they had suffered before, just, you know, of sorting through that emotion, you know. And I don't know if really that's what you were looking for, but it was something that was evident in children, you know.
You know, so one way to approach that is that it's very difficult. So as you know, Katie McLaughlin has talked a lot about threat versus deprivation. And Martin Teicher at McLean has talked about physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and the like, trying to tease these things apart from a neuroscience perspective. It hasn't been very easy to do that, because often kids are experiencing, so 80% of kids in the child protection system in the U.S. experience neglect, but many are experiencing lots of other things as well. So teasing apart the different types of maltreatment is difficult to look at in terms of the brain. But where it's important is it will help us design better interventions if we can target, if we understand the causal pathway from one type of adversity to another. But we're not there yet. And because, in part, we can't do naturalistic experiments. We can't randomly assign kids to physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, right? So the best we have is animal models. And that helps us get at the biology, but it's not very realistic either. So we have an animal model to some work we're doing where it's called fragmented care. So you take a rat that has just had babies, or a mouse that has just had babies, but you don't give her, it's when she's pregnant, you don't give her nesting material, so she can't build a nest for her pups, which drives her nuts. Think of growing up in profound poverty and not being able to provide for your kids. So this fragmented care model helps us get at this a little bit again, but still a mouse and a rat is not the best model for the kinds of things that we're talking about. Judy.
Dr. Edersheim, you've got the final word, really, with a question.
Yeah, I'm really sneaky about that kind of thing, getting the last word in here and at home. Fantastic panel today. I want to address actually something that, I'm sorry, I did not catch your name, from MGH. You asked a marvelous question, which is, what does the law need? And in part, the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior was designed for that question in particular, which is scientists are used to doing their work in isolation, and lawyers do their work in isolation. And if you ask lawyers what science do they need, then we can provide that science when it exists, when it almost exists, as long as it's faithful. So one question I think that science could help you in your wonderful work would be the question of the consistency requirements. So you have a legal regime, and the regime may be manualized. Judge Gertner and I were speaking about this. The standard may be, so you have to worry about appeals, of course. You can't just worry about at the hearing stage, because if you want to overturn something that was denied based on consistency, you have to have some mechanism as you appeal. Now imagine, this has been a very successful approach in many other ways, where science actually undercuts, proper science undercuts a misrepresentation of the mind, which is pervasive in law. So the misrepresentation here that science can correct right now is one it has corrected in other legal arenas and been successful. So for example, the neuroscience of memory has corrected many misunderstandings in law. For example, single eyewitness testimony. Judge Gertner and I, along with the Juvenile Law Center, wrote an amicus brief incorporating the science with the help of Dan Schachter and his folks at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences to say the law's representation of the science of memory is 200 years at least out of date. Memory, for example, is not a video camera. It is not laid down and recalled like a videotape. It can be fragmented by trauma. It can be misrecollected by trauma. It can be inarticulated because of trauma. And it is also a lot of work by Roger Pittman at MGH. It can be an unstable product depending on how it is retrieved and the moment of its retrieval. So science has actually been very successful in undermining that narrative in other venues, and that would be the one that I would focus on for you because of your procedural constraints. So that's my first goal in standing up, and there are lots of people in this room right now who can make this happen, and lots of people whom I would like to introduce you to afterwards.
Thank you.
The next point is to really cheer up Chuck Nelson. You have made a contribution that will have legs of its own. So, for example, even in this political climate, the one thing that seems to make sweeping group-level changes in the law is neuroscience. Lawrence Steinberg, Leah Somerville, adolescent neurodevelopment and decision-making is the biggest change in criminal law of the past 20 years, where a society completely unwilling to abandon its penchant for executing juveniles did a 180-degree turn to being now having juvenile murder off the table. And this is actually progressing to the point where adolescent neuroscience, again, Judge Gertner and I have collaborated on this with Robert Kinshirov and others, to undermine criminal law doctrines that actually misrepresent the nature of adolescent decision-making. So science is actually the thing that seems to be consistently cutting through, whether it's the science of memory, whether it's the science of biology, and you have more on your side with childhood because of the work you've done, because adolescence could be characterized as a sensitive period, but there is no question that childhood is a critical period, that as Leah Somerville would say, moving parts get broken. When those moving parts break, they break for good. And so actually, I think the sky is the limit for your science in this realm. And that's my cheer you up.